The scent of dust and dreams filled the air as Madeline Zephyr nailed her hastily painted sign to the outside of the old abandoned schoolhouse at the edge of Julesburg, Colorado. Her hands were blistered, her blue calico dress streaked with dirt, but her eyes, a startling shade of green even in the dim light of dusk, burned with the unwavering determination that had carried her across 3 states and more heartache than any 22-year-old should endure. It was 1876, a year when most women her age were already married with children or resigned to spinsterhood. But Madeline had different plans that had made her the subject of whispers and outright mockery since arriving in town 3 weeks ago. The sign she hung read simply, "Zephyr School of Science and Mathematics for Girls." As the final nail went in, a low whistle sounded behind her. Madeline turned to find Sheriff Grayson leaning against his horse, his weathered face twisted in a mixture of amusement and pity. "Miss Zephyr, I admire your enthusiasm," he said, tipping his hat. "But might I suggest something more practical? Perhaps a seamstress shop. Mrs. Henderson needs help with the laundry, honest work for an unmarried lady." Madeline climbed down from her perch and straightened her shoulders. "With all due respect, Sheriff, I didn't travel 1,800 miles to wash someone else's linens. Girls deserve education beyond homemaking. They deserve to understand the stars, mathematics, and science." The sheriff chuckled, shaking his head. "The parents in this town won't be sending their daughters to learn such nonsense. Waste of good money that could go toward a proper dowry." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat again. "Good day, Miss Zephyr. I hope reality finds you gently." As he rode away, Madeline pressed her palm against the rough wood of her sign. 3 months of savings had gone into purchasing this dilapidated building. Another month's worth into supplies. She had $6.32 left to her name. "I'll show them," she whispered to the gathering darkness. "I'll show them all." The next morning, Madeline rose before dawn. She swept the schoolhouse floor, arranged her 12 borrowed chairs in neat rows, and placed her most prized possession, a brass telescope her father had gifted her before his passing, on the teacher's desk. By 8 o'clock, she stood on the front steps, hair neatly pinned, wearing her best dress, a navy blue with lace collar that had belonged to her mother. Not a single student arrived. By noon, Madeline sat alone at the teacher's desk, thumbing through her astronomy textbook and pretending the ache in her chest was from hunger, not disappointment. The bell above the door jingled, and her heart leapt only to find Mrs. Peterson, the general store owner's wife, standing in the doorway. "Just wanted to see if the rumors were true," Mrs. Peterson said, her eyes scanning the empty classroom. "My Josephine said you were serious about this school." She pronounced the word as though it tasted bitter. "My husband says it's unnatural, filling girls' heads with numbers and such, makes them unsuitable for marriage." Madeline gripped the edge of her desk. "Mrs. Peterson, wouldn't you want Josephine to know how to calculate proper change, to understand the world around her?" The woman's mouth tightened. "She knows what she needs to know. My daughter will be a wife and mother, not some oddity who speaks of planets and equations." She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "The town's talkin', Miss Zephyr. They're saying you're touched in the head." "I'd reconsider your position if I were you." After Mrs. Peterson left, Madeline buried her face in her hands. She'd known it would be difficult, but the reality of her isolation hit harder than expected. By closing time, not a single student had darkened her door. The next morning, she found "Crazy" painted in red across her sign. The day after, someone had nailed a notice beneath hers advertising proper ladies' instruction in homemaking and virtue at the church. By the end of the week, children pointed and whispered when she walked past. Mothers ushered their daughters to the other side of the street. The local newspaper, the Julesburg Sentinel, ran an editorial questioning whether radical feminine education was a sign of moral decay in their peaceful town. Yet each morning, Madeline unlocked the schoolhouse door. Each day, she prepared lessons no one would hear. Each night, she added a mark to her calendar, counting down the days until her money ran out completely. It was on the 12th day, as Madeline walked home in the fading light, that she first encountered him. She'd taken to wandering the outskirts of town, studying the flora and making notes in her journal partially for scientific interest, partially to avoid the stares of townspeople. A gunshot cracked through the evening air, sending her diving to the ground on instinct. Heart hammering, she peered over the tall grass to see a man on horseback, rifle raised, taking aim at something in the distance. "Excuse me," she called, outraged at having been frightened. "There are people walking here," the rider turned, surprise evident even from a distance. He lowered his rifle and guided his horse toward her. As he approached, Madeline's indignation faltered slightly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat. His face was tanned and wind-worn, but not unkind, with striking blue eyes that assessed her with undisguised curiosity. "My apologies, madam," he said, dismounting with easy grace. His voice held an unusual accent she couldn't place. "I didn't expect anyone to be botanizing at this hour." Madeline clutched her journal to her chest. "I wasn't botanizing, I was walking." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he glanced at the pencil tucked behind her ear and the smudges of graphite on her fingertips. "Of course, just walking, with detailed notes and specimens." Heat rushed to her cheeks. "What I do is none of your concern, Mr. Isaiah Xavier," he replied, extending a hand. When she hesitated, he added, "Recently of Montana, presently of nowhere in particular." Reluctantly, Madeline shook his hand. "Madeline Zephyr." "Recently of Boston, presently of Julesburg." Recognition flashed in his eyes. "Ah, the schoolteacher," she stiffened. "You've heard of me." Isaiah Xavier leaned against his saddle, seemingly in no hurry. "Hard not to. Small towns thrive on gossip, and a woman teaching science to girls is juicier gossip than most." "And I suppose you think I'm crazy too?" she challenged. He studied her for a long moment. "I think the truly crazy ones are those who see the world changing around them and insist on standing still." He picked up his rifle and secured it to his saddle. "What exactly are you teaching? In this school of yours?" The unexpected question caught her off guard. "Mathematics, natural sciences, astronomy, literature, history beyond kings and generals, women's contributions too." He nodded thoughtfully. "Useful knowledge?" "Yes, well, apparently not useful enough for Julesburg," Madeline replied bitterly. She glanced at the darkening sky. "I should be going. May I escort you back to town? These plains can be dangerous after dark." She hesitated, weighing her options. A woman alone with a strange man would certainly add fuel to the gossip fire, but the coyotes had been howling closer to town lately. "I suppose that would be prudent," she finally conceded. They walked in silence for several minutes, Isaiah leading his horse beside them. Finally, curiosity got the better of her. "What were you shooting at, Mr. Xavier?" "Call me Isaiah," he replied. "I was hunting, or trying to. Haven't eaten since yesterday." Madeline frowned. "Are you a drifter?" he chuckled. "Not by choice. I'm what you might call between opportunities. I was working cattle up north, but the operation folded. Heard there might be work at the Collins Ranch outside Julesburg." "I see." She studied him surreptitiously. Despite his weathered appearance, there was an intelligence in his eyes that surprised her. "And what did you do before driving cattle?" Something guarded crossed his face. "A little of everything. Fought in the war. Did some surveying for the railroad, prospected for a spell. You don't strike me as a typical cowboy, and you don't strike me as a typical schoolteacher." His eyes met hers with surprising intensity. "We all have our stories, Miss Zephyr." As they reached the edge of town, Madeline stopped. "This is far enough. Thank you for the escort, but I'd rather not give the gossips more ammunition." Isaiah nodded, understanding without offense. "One question before you go. The astronomy you mentioned, do you teach about the recent transit of Venus?" Madeline stared at him, momentarily speechless. You know about the transit of Venus," he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. "December 1874, visible from parts of America. A rare opportunity to calculate the astronomical unit with precision." "How do you know about astronomical calculations?" she demanded, unable to hide her astonishment. Isaiah touched the brim of his hat. "Like I said, Miss Zephyr, we all have our stories." He mounted his horse with practiced ease. "Perhaps I'll stop by your school sometime. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on Professor Newcomb's solar parallax measurements." Before she could form a response, he was riding away, leaving Madeline staring after him in bewilderment. For the first time since arriving in Julesburg, she felt a tiny spark of something beyond determination, something that felt dangerously like hope. The following morning, Madeline opened her schoolhouse to find a small bundle on the front step. Inside was a book, a treatise on celestial mechanics by Pierre-Simon Laplace, dog-eared and water-stained, but complete. A note tucked inside reads simply, "Knowledge deserves to be shared. IX." She ran her fingers over the worn cover, wondering how a wandering cowboy had come to possess such a scientific text, and why he would part with it. More puzzling still was why she found herself hoping he would make good on his suggestion to visit her school. 3 days passed without sign of Isaiah Xavier. Madeline kept the book on her desk, occasionally glancing at the door whenever she heard footsteps outside. By Friday, she had resigned herself to the likelihood that the mysterious cowboy had moved on, as drifters tend to do. That afternoon, as she was preparing to close up for another empty week, the bell above the door jangled. Madeline looked up, expecting perhaps Mrs. Peterson come to gloat again, and instead found a young girl no more than 12 standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Hello," Madeline said softly, afraid a sudden movement might scare the child away. "May I help you?" The girl twisted her hands in her faded calico dress. "Are you the lady who teaches about stars?" Madeline's heart skipped. "I am. My name is Miss Zephyr, and you are?" "Emma Collins," the girl replied. "My pa owns the ranch west of town." Collins, the name Isaiah had mentioned. "Coincidence? It's lovely to meet you, Emma." "Would you like to see my telescope?" Madeline asked, gesturing to the brass instrument. Emma's eyes widened. "Could I?" "Pa says it's foolishness, but—" She trailed off, looking conflicted. "But what?" Madeline encouraged gently. "But Mr. Xavier said smart girls make smart women and smart women change the world." She said it like reciting a lesson. "He works for my pa now. He showed me how stars move in patterns and told me you know all about them." Madeline felt warmth spreading through her chest. "Did he now? Well, he's right about one thing, you do seem like a very smart girl." Emma approached the telescope cautiously. "He said you have books about more than just stars, about plants and animals and numbers too." "I do indeed." Madeline moved to her bookshelf, pulling out a beautifully illustrated natural history text. "Would you like to look at this one?" For the next hour, Madeline showed Emma through her collection of books, explaining basic concepts of biology and astronomy. The girl soaked up information like parched earth in rain, asking questions so insightful they occasionally caught Madeline off guard. As the sun began to set, Emma reluctantly gathered her things. I should go. Pa thinks I'm at the general store. She hesitated at the door. Could I come back tomorrow? Madeline fought to keep her voice steady. This is a school, Emma. You're welcome any time we're open. After Emma left, Madeline sat at her desk, hands trembling slightly. One student. After almost 3 weeks, one student had found her way here. And somehow, Isaiah Xavier had something to do with it. The next day, Emma returned, this time with a timid friend named Sarah in tow. The day after that, they brought another girl. By Wednesday of the following week, Madeline had 5 students, all arriving surreptitiously, all from families connected to the Collins Ranch in some way. It was nearly 2 weeks later when Isaiah Xavier finally appeared at her door, late one afternoon after the girls had gone. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand, looking decidedly uncomfortable in clean clothes that seemed too stiff for his frame. Mr. Xavier, Madeline acknowledged, trying to sound merely polite rather than revealing how often she'd thought of him. I believe I have you to thank for my sudden increase in enrollment. He shrugged, stepping inside and glancing around the modest classroom. I may have mentioned your school to some of the hands at the ranch, men with daughters, mentioned how education might mean better opportunities. His eyes fell on the Laplace book still on her desk. I see you found my gift. I did, thank you. She hesitated, then added, it's not exactly common reading material for a ranch hand. A smile flickered across his face. No, I suppose not. Who are you really, Isaiah Xavier? The question escaped before she could stop it. He met her gaze directly. A man who's made mistakes. Who's tried to outrun his past by heading west. Who's done things he regrets and a few he's proud of. He moved closer, examining the star charts she'd drawn on the blackboard. And who once studied astronomy at Yale before the war called him away and life took unexpected turns. Madeline stared at him, pieces falling into place. His knowledge of celestial mechanics, his unusual vocabulary, the way he carried himself not like someone born to physical labor. You were a student at Yale. Almost graduated, he confirmed. Then the war happened. I joined up, spent 4 years fighting. When I came home, he shook his head. The man who left for war wasn't the same one who returned. I couldn't sit in lecture halls anymore, couldn't focus on equations when I'd seen what I'd seen. So you came west. So I came west, he agreed. Tried my hand at many things. Found I was good with horses and cattle, less good at staying in one place. He turned to her, his expression softening. Until I heard about a crazy Boston schoolteacher trying to teach girls science in a town that didn't want her. Madeline felt heat rise to her cheeks. And that interested you. It reminded me that courage comes in many forms, he said simply. Not just on battlefields. The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. Well, she managed, I appreciate your recruitment efforts. Though I doubt the parents know where their daughters are spending their afternoons. Isaiah shrugged. They know. They just don't acknowledge it openly. Easier that way they can save face in town while their girls learn something useful. Cowardly, Madeline muttered. Practical, Isaiah countered. People rarely change their minds through confrontation, Miss Zephyr. They change when they see results. He moved toward the door. Speaking of which, I should return to the ranch. Mr. Collins is a fair employer, but he expects full days. Madeline followed him to the door. Will you come back? He studied her for a long moment. Would you like me to? I would appreciate discussing Laplace's theories with someone who understands them, she said carefully. A smile tugged at his lips. Then I'll return, perhaps Sunday. I have the afternoon free. After he left, Madeline stood in the empty classroom, heart beating faster than it should. Isaiah Xavier was nothing like the men she'd known in Boston, scholars and gentlemen who spoke of theories but never got their hands dirty. He was nothing like the ranch hands and shopkeepers of Julesburg either, with their narrow views and suspicious minds. He was something else entirely. And for the first time since arriving in Colorado, Madeline found herself thinking about something other than her school's survival. By early October, Madeline's school had grown to 12 students, still all girls, still arriving with excuses and stories to explain their absences from home, but attending regularly nonetheless. The change in them was remarkable. Emma Collins, once shy and hesitant, now confidently calculated orbital velocities and could identify major constellations. Sarah Johnson had revealed a talent for botany, carefully cataloging local plants with scientific precision. Word was spreading, albeit quietly. Even Mrs. Peterson had stopped making snide comments when Madeline shopped at the general store, though she was far from supportive. Isaiah visited regularly, ostensibly to discuss scientific principles, but their conversations ranged far beyond astronomy. He told her of his childhood in Connecticut, his father a professor of literature, his mother an immigrant from Ireland who instilled in him a love of poetry. Madeline shared stories of growing up with a physician father who encouraged her curiosity, and a mother who taught mathematics despite social disapproval. One Sunday afternoon in late October, they sat on the schoolhouse steps, watching the sunset paint the Colorado plains in shades of amber and gold. "Winter will be here soon," Isaiah remarked. "Have you thought about how you'll heat this place?" Madeline frowned. She'd been avoiding that particular problem. "Coal is expensive. I've been setting aside what little tuition I collect, but it won't be enough for the whole season." "The girls could bring wood," he suggested, "each family contributing." "That would mean acknowledging their daughters attend my school," Madeline pointed out. Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. "Times are changing, Madeline. Slowly, perhaps, but changing nonetheless." He rarely used her first name, and it sent an unexpected thrill through her when he did. "The Collins boy Jonathan asked me yesterday why his sister gets to learn about planets while he has to memorize Bible verses at the town school." Madeline laughed. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask his father," Isaiah replied with a grin, then suggested that perhaps he could borrow Emma's notes if he was truly interested in learning. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. They'd been careful until now, maintaining the propriety of friendship, but Madeline wasn't blind to the way his gaze sometimes lingered, or how her pulse quickened when their hands accidentally touched. "Isaiah," she began, uncertain what she meant to say. A shout from down the road interrupted them. Sheriff Grayson was riding toward the schoolhouse at a gallop, his expression grim. "Fire at the Collins Ranch," he called as he approached. "All hands needed. Eastern barn is ablaze and spreading fast." Isaiah was on his feet instantly. "Are there horses inside?" "Full stable," the sheriff confirmed. "Collins is trying to get them out, but it's bad." Without hesitation, Isaiah turned to Madeline. "I have to go." "I'm coming with you," she replied, already gathering her skirts. "It's dangerous. I know basic medical care," she cut him off, "and those are my students' families." There was no time to argue. The sheriff had already continued on to spread the alarm in town. Isaiah whistled for his horse, which grazed nearby during his visits. In one fluid motion, he mounted and extended his hand down to Madeline. She grasped it firmly, allowing him to swing her up behind him. "Hold tight," he warned, and spurred the horse into a gallop. The ride to the Collins Ranch was a blur of dust and pounding hooves. Madeline clung to Isaiah's waist, the solid warmth of him her anchor as they raced toward the orange glow now visible on the horizon. As they crested the final hill, the devastation came into full view. The eastern barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching skyward like hungry fingers. Men formed a bucket brigade from the well to the western edge of the fire, trying desperately to keep it from spreading to the main house and other outbuildings. Horses screamed inside the burning structure, the sound chilling Madeline to her core. Without hesitation, Isaiah rode directly toward the inferno, stopping only when the heat became too intense for the horse. "Get to the house," he instructed as he helped her down. "Check for injuries, burns, smoke inhalation. I'm going to help with the horses." Before she could protest, he was running toward Mr. Collins and several ranch hands who were attempting to open the far side of the barn, where the horses were stabled. Madeline gathered her skirts and ran toward the main house, where Emma stood on the porch, clutching her younger brother's hand, her face streaked with tears. "Miss Zephyr," she cried, "Father's prize stallion is still inside." "The men are working on it," Madeline assured her, quickly assessing the children for injuries. "Is your mother here? Is anyone hurt?" "Mother's tending to Hank. He got burned trying to get the horses out," Emma reported, remarkably composed despite her tears. "In the kitchen." Madeline hurried inside, finding Mrs. Collins, a stern-faced woman who had never acknowledged her applying cold cloths to a young ranch hand's blistered arms. "Mrs. Collins, I have medical training," Madeline said without preamble. "May I assist?" The woman looked up, recognition and brief surprise crossing her face before necessity overrode prejudice. "His burns need proper dressing. I have nothing but kitchen cloths." "My petticoat is clean cotton," Madeline said, already reaching under her skirt to tear strips from the garment. "And I have herbs in my pocket that can help with the pain and prevent infection." For the next hour, Madeline worked alongside Mrs. Collins, treating burns and cuts as injured men staggered in from the firefighting efforts. She lost track of time, focused entirely on easing suffering, until a commotion outside drew their attention. They got the horses out. Someone shouted. Madeline ran to the porch in time to see Isaiah and Mr. Collins leading the last of the frightened animals to a corral far from the fire. Both men were blackened with soot, their clothes singed but moving under their own power. Relief washed over her. The barn, however, was a total loss. As the bucket brigade finally subdued the last of the flames, all that remained was a smoldering skeleton of charred wood. How did it start? Madeline asked Emma, who had remained steadfastly on the porch throughout the ordeal. "Lightning," the girl replied. "From the storm that passed through earlier. Must have struck and smoldered before catching properly." As the chaos subsided, Madeline continued treating minor injuries, while Isaiah helped the ranch hands secure the rescued horses. It was well past midnight when Mr. Collins finally approached the porch, where Madeline was washing soot from her hands in a basin of now black water. "Miss Zephyr," he said formally. He was a broad-shouldered man with a face weathered by years under the Colorado sun. "I believe I owe you my gratitude. My wife says your knowledge of medicine made a significant difference tonight." Madeline straightened. "I'm only glad I could help, Mr. Collins." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward where his daughter stood nearby. "Emma tells me you've been teaching her astronomy and mathematics." Madeline held her breath, unsure how to respond. "She calculated the trajectory of that lightning bolt," he continued, surprising her. "Said something about atmospheric conditions and metal attracting electrical discharge. Told me weeks ago we should install lightning rods on the barns." He shook his head ruefully. "Perhaps I should have listened." "Emma is exceptionally bright," Madeline offered cautiously. Collins looked at her directly. "My daughter says you're not crazy, Miss Zephyr. She says you're the smartest person she's ever met." He extended his hand. "I'd like to formally enroll her in your school." "Proper like, with tuition paid up front," not in secret. Madeline's hands trembled slightly as she accepted his handshake. "I would be honored to continue teaching Emma, Mr. Collins. And," he added, lowering his voice, "if my foreman happens to take a shine to her teacher, well, I suppose Yale education counts for something, even if he did end up a cowboy." Before Madeline could process this remark, Collins walked away to consult with his ranch hands. She stood frozen, the implications of his words spinning in her mind. Isaiah approached a few minutes later, face still streaked with soot but wearing a tired smile. "No casualties, human or equine," he reported. "Something of a miracle. Mr. Collins just offered to officially enroll Emma in my school," Madeline said, still dazed. Isaiah's smile widened. "Did he? That's excellent news. He also implied that he knows about your educational background." "Ah." Isaiah rubbed the back of his neck. "Collins is more observant than most, hard to hide certain habits of speech and knowledge. We've had a few conversations about my past." "And he mentioned something else." Madeline took a deep breath. "He suggested you might have personal interest in Emma's teacher." In the flickering light of the lanterns, she saw color rise beneath the soot on his face. "Collins has always been direct to the point of impropriety. Is he wrong?" she asked softly. Isaiah held her gaze. "You know he isn't." He glanced around at the activity still surrounding them. "This isn't the time or place for such a conversation." "Then when?" Madeline pressed, suddenly unwilling to let the moment pass. Perhaps it was the night's drama, the reminder of life's fragility, but caution seemed less important than honesty. "Sunday," he said finally. "Come riding with me. There's a place I want to show you where we can talk properly." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The Collins fire marked a turning point for Madeline's school. By Friday, 5 more students had officially enrolled, their parents arriving in person to sign registration forms and pay proper tuition. The townspeople's attitudes hadn't completely changed, but there was a new respect in their interactions, a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps Miss Zephyr wasn't entirely crazy after all. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline autumn day that made the Colorado landscape seem impossibly vast and beautiful. Isaiah arrived at the schoolhouse promptly at noon, leading 2 horses, his own chestnut gelding and a gentle-looking bay mare. "I borrowed her from Collins," he explained as he helped Madeline mount. "She's steady and reliable." They rode in companionable silence, heading west from town toward the foothills. After an hour's journey, Isaiah led them up a winding path to a high promontory overlooking the valley. Below, Julesburg looked like a child's toy town, surrounded by patchwork fields and the silver ribbon of the river. "It's beautiful," Madeline breathed, dismounting to better appreciate the view. "I found this spot my second day working for Collins," Isaiah said, securing both horses to a nearby tree. "I've come here often to think, to remember who I was before the war and consider who I might become." He spread a blanket on a flat rock and gestured for her to sit. From his saddlebag he produced a small meal, bread, cheese and apples, and a battered metal flask. "Just coffee," he assured her with a smile, "though I considered something stronger for courage." Madeline accepted a piece of bread. "Do you need courage to talk to me, Isaiah?" "More than I needed to charge into that burning barn," he admitted. His blue eyes met hers directly. "Madeline, I came to Julesburg with no expectations beyond finding work. I certainly never expected to find someone like you." "Someone crazy," she teased gently. "Someone visionary," he corrected. "Someone who sees possibilities where others see only traditions to be maintained. Someone unafraid to stand alone for what she believes." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. "It's been less standing and more stubbornly refusing to fall. Call it what you will." He moved to sit beside her. close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the autumn chill. "I've watched you these past weeks, teaching girls who arrive in secret, facing mockery with dignity, building something meaningful despite every obstacle. And I've found myself thinking about staying in one place for the first time in years." Madeline's heart quickened. "Isaiah, let me finish," he said gently. "I know your school is your priority. I know my background, a failed scholar turned drifter, hardly makes me a suitable match in conventional terms. But I find myself unable to imagine riding away from Julesburg now. Unable to imagine not seeing you teach, not discussing Laplace or Newton or whatever book we're currently arguing about." He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking if you might consider the possibility of us, whatever that might mean, alongside your dreams for your school." Madeline looked at their joined hands, then up at the endless Colorado sky. Since arriving in Julesburg, she'd thought of little beyond survival and proving herself. Personal happiness had seemed a distant luxury compared to her mission. Yet in this man, this curious blend of scholar and cowboy, this person who saw her not as crazy but as visionary, she sensed a different kind of possibility. "The town would talk," she said finally. Isaiah laughed. "The town already talks. Let them talk about something real for a change. And you wouldn't resent it, being tied to the crazy school teacher." "I would be proud," he said simply. "Proud to be associated with the woman changing Julesburg one girl at a time." Madeline studied his face, open, honest, waiting for her response without pressure. In Boston, she'd had suitors, proper young men who spoke of supporting her little teaching hobby, until children came along. None had ever looked at her the way Isaiah did now, as if she were not just acceptable but extraordinary. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to explore those possibilities with you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward. Their lips met in a kiss that started gentle but deepened with a surprising intensity that left them both breathless when they finally parted. "I should warn you," Isaiah murmured, his forehead resting against hers, "that I may be out of practice at being in one place, at building something lasting." "Then we'll learn together," Madeline replied. "I'm told I'm a rather good teacher." The winter of 1876 brought heavy snows to Julesburg, but Madeline's school remained warm, thanks to wood provided by the Collins Ranch and coal purchased with her growing tuition funds. By Christmas, she had 20 students, 19 girls and 1 boy, Jonathan Collins, who had finally convinced his father that astronomy was too interesting to be restricted to his sister. Isaiah continued working at the Collins Ranch, but spent most evenings at the schoolhouse, helping Madeline prepare lessons or simply reading quietly while she graded papers. Their relationship progressed with the steady, unhurried pace of people confident in their connection. They took Sunday rides whenever weather permitted, explored the countryside together, and gradually became a recognized pair in town. Not everyone approved, of course. Mrs. Peterson still sniffed disapprovingly when they walked together on Sundays. The town minister occasionally made veiled references to modern relationships lacking propriety in his sermons. But increasingly, the voices of support outweighed the critics. In January, Madeline received a letter that changed everything. The Denver Education Society, having heard of her innovative rural science curriculum, invited her to present her teaching methods at their annual conference in April. The letter, signed by the Society's president, specifically mentioned her work encouraging girls in mathematics and astronomy. "They want me to speak," she told Isaiah that evening, still dazed by the unexpected recognition, "in Denver, to educators from across the territory. Of course they do, he replied, unsurprised. Word travels. What you're doing here is remarkable, Madeline. She bit her lip. I can't afford the train fare and closing the school for a week. The school can manage without you for a few days. Emma is perfectly capable of leading basic lessons, Isaiah pointed out. As for the fare, he hesitated. I've been saving. For a purpose I hadn't fully determined. Consider it an investment in education. Madeline started to protest, but he silenced her with a look. Let me do this, he said simply. Please. In the end, she accepted both his financial assistance and his offer to accompany her to Denver. The journey would be their first trip together, their first experience beyond the boundaries of Julesburg and its surrounding countryside. As April approached, Madeline worked feverishly on her presentation, often falling asleep at her desk, pages of notes scattered around her. Isaiah would find her there and gently guide her to the small cot in the back room where she sometimes napped during lunch breaks. You're working too hard, he chided one evening, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. I want to make them understand, she explained, fighting exhaustion. This isn't just about teaching girls to calculate planetary orbits. It's about showing them they're capable of anything, that their minds matter. Isaiah's expression softened. They'll understand, because when you speak about it, your passion makes it impossible not to. The morning of their departure for Denver dawned clear and mild. Isaiah arrived at the schoolhouse to find Madeline pacing nervously, surrounded by stacked papers and a half-packed valise. I'm having second thoughts, she admitted. What if they're only inviting me as a curiosity? The crazy woman teaching science to ranch girls. Isaiah took her hands, stilling her movement. Then you'll show them how powerful crazy can be. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. Madeline, you've already changed lives here. Emma Collins is talking about applying to college in Boulder. Sarah Johnson's father told me yesterday she corrected his calculations for the spring planting and saved him $50 in seed. Madeline managed a smile. I know, just nothing, Isaiah interrupted gently. You are extraordinary. Denver will see that just as clearly as I do. He picked up her papers and organized them efficiently into her leather portfolio. Now, we have a train to catch. The journey to Denver was Madeline's first train ride since arriving in Colorado. She spent much of it with her face pressed to the window, watching the landscape transform from plains to foothills to the distant mountains beyond. Isaiah sat beside her, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories of places he'd traveled during his years of wandering. Denver itself was a revelation after months in tiny Julesburg. Streets bustled with activity, fine brick buildings lined the main thoroughfares, and the variety of businessmen in suits, ladies in fashionable dresses, workers of all descriptions created a vibrant tapestry of humanity that made Madeline realize how isolated she'd been. The Denver Education Society had arranged accommodations for them at a modest but respectable hotel. Isaiah, ever conscious of propriety, had insisted on separate rooms, though the knowing smile of the desk clerk suggested their relationship was assumed regardless. Will you be nervous tomorrow? Madeline asked as they dined together in the hotel restaurant that evening. Isaiah looked up from his steak in surprise. Me, I'm not the one presenting, but you'll be there, she said. In an auditorium full of educators, men who might have been your colleagues had life taken different turns. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Ah, you're worried about how I'll feel among scholars. She nodded, relieved he understood without further explanation. Isaiah considered his response carefully. There was a time when I would have felt out of place. When I measured my worth by the degree I never completed. He reached across the table to take her hand. But that was before a certain school teacher showed me that true education isn't about credentials. It's about curiosity, about seeking knowledge wherever you can find it. Madeline squeezed his hand. "You're a remarkable man, Isaiah Xavier," says the woman who's about to tell Denver how she revolutionized education in a town that called her crazy, he replied with a smile. The next morning, Madeline dressed in her best outfit, a forest green dress with modest lace trim that she'd purchased specifically for the occasion. Isaiah escorted her to the imposing brick building where the conference was being held, his steady presence calming her frayed nerves. "I'll be in the back," he promised as they reached the presentation hall. "Right there if you need an encouraging face." The room was already half full of educators, primarily men, though Madeline was relieved to see several women among them. She made her way to the front, where the society's president, Dr. Harrison, greeted her with unexpected warmth. "Miss Zephyr, we're delighted you could join us. Your paper on rural scientific education for girls was most impressive." Madeline blinked in surprise. She'd sent a brief outline of her work, not a formal paper. "Thank you, though I'm afraid it was hardly scholarly, on the contrary," interrupted a white-haired gentleman standing nearby. "Your practical application of theoretical principles is exactly what education in the territories needs. Too many of us become lost in academia without considering real-world implementation." As more educators gathered, Madeline found herself engaged in stimulating discussion about teaching methods, rural education challenges, and the particular obstacles facing female students. By the time she stood to deliver her formal presentation, her nervousness had transformed into eager enthusiasm. For 40 minutes, she spoke about her experiences in Julesburg, the initial resistance, the gradual acceptance, and the remarkable achievements of her students. She shared teaching techniques developed out of necessity with limited resources, and her observations about how practical application of scientific principles resonated with children from agricultural backgrounds. Throughout, she occasionally caught Isaiah's eye at the back of the room, his proud smile reinforcing her confidence. When she finally concluded, the applause was immediate and genuine. Questions followed, thoughtful, respectful inquiries about specifics of her curriculum and methods. Afterward, educators crowded around her, offering congratulations and, more surprisingly, invitations. Would she consider writing a more comprehensive paper for their journal? Would she be willing to advise on curriculum development for territorial schools? Would she accept a donation of books for her school library? By late afternoon, when she finally escaped the conference hall on Isaiah's arm, Madeline was overwhelmed by the response. "They didn't think I was crazy," she said wonderingly as they walked back toward their hotel. "They thought I was." "Innovative, visionary," Isaiah corrected, using the word he'd first applied to her months ago, "just as I've always said." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I couldn't have done this without you. You know that, don't you?" "Nonsense. You were changing Julesburg before I arrived." "Trying to," she conceded, "but failing mostly. You believed in me when no one else did. You found me students. You." She hesitated, then continued, "You made me believe I wasn't crazy for dreaming." Isaiah's expression softened. He glanced around the busy street, then guided her to a quieter side avenue lined with trees just beginning to bud in the spring warmth. There, partially sheltered from public view, he took both her hands in his. "Madeline Zephyr," he said, his voice unusually solemn. "From the moment I met you, botanizing while pretending to just be walking, I knew you were extraordinary. These past months have only confirmed what I suspected then, that you are the most remarkable person I've ever known." He took a deep breath. "I had planned to do this differently, perhaps on our promontory overlooking Julesburg or under the stars you love so much. But watching you today, seeing others finally recognize what I've always seen in you, I find I can't wait any longer." To Madeline's astonishment, he lowered himself to one knee on the dusty path, still holding her hands. "I love you," he said simply. "Your passion, your determination, your kindness, your intelligence, everything about you. I know we've spoken only vaguely of future possibilities, but I find myself unable to imagine any future without you in it." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. Inside was a ring, a simple band of gold with a small, perfect diamond at its center. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it with me through all my wanderings, never expecting to find someone worthy of it until now." He looked up at her, his blue eyes earnest. "Madeline Zephyr, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" For perhaps the first time in her life, Madeline found herself speechless. Tears sprang to her eyes as the reality of the moment washed over her. This man, this complicated, intelligent, supportive man who saw her not as she was but as she could be, was offering her a partnership she'd never dared imagine possible. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, Isaiah, I would be honored to be your wife." His smile was radiant as he slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if destined. When he rose to kiss her, Madeline forgot they were on a public street in Denver. She forgot about educational conferences and presentations. She forgot everything except the feeling of coming home, of finding a place where she belonged completely. That evening, they celebrated with dinner at Denver's finest restaurant, courtesy of an honorarium the Education Society had presented to Madeline for her contribution to the conference. Over candlelight, they began tentatively discussing their future together. "I've been offered a permanent position at the Collins Ranch," Isaiah told her. "Foreman with a proper cabin included. Collins mentioned it before we left, said he'd hold it until we returned." "That would be wonderful," Madeline replied. "The cabin is close enough to town that I could still run the school easily." "About that," Isaiah said carefully, "have you considered what today might mean for your school? Those educators were genuinely impressed, Madeline. There might be opportunities beyond Julesburg if you wanted them." She considered this, turning her wine glass slowly. "I've thought about it. The invitation to advise on territorial curriculum is tempting, but honestly, I love my school. I love seeing Emma and Sarah and the others discover their capabilities. I'm not ready to leave that behind for something more administrative." Relief washed over Isaiah's face. "I'm glad. I would support you wherever your dreams led, but I've grown fond of our little town, crazy as that may seem." "Not crazy at all," Madeline smiled, reaching for his hand. "Visionary, perhaps." They returned to Julesburg as heroes of sorts. Word of Madeline's success in Denver had somehow preceded them, transforming her status in town from tolerated oddity to celebrated local figure. Even Mrs. Peterson greeted her warmly at the general store, inquiring whether her granddaughter might be old enough for science lessons. Their engagement announcement was met with knowing nods rather than surprise. Sheriff Grayson, upon hearing the news, merely commented, "About time," as if he'd been expecting it all along. Emma Collins squealed with delight and immediately began planning decorations for what she called the most scientific wedding Julesburg has ever seen. They were married on Midsummer's Day, 1877, on the promontory overlooking Julesburg, where they'd first acknowledged their feelings. Mr. Collins, now one of Madeline's staunchest supporters, offered the location on his property and helped arrange for benches to be transported up the winding path. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, with Madeline's students forming an honor guard and Emma Collins serving as her attendant. Madeline wore a cream-colored dress ordered from Denver, with sprigs of wildflowers in her hair instead of a traditional veil. Isaiah, resplendent in a new black suit, looked at her with such naked adoration as she approached that several of the hardened ranch hands were seen discreetly wiping their eyes. "I take you, Madeline Zephyr," Isaiah vowed, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "to be my wife and partner in all things. I promise to support your dreams, to cherish your mind as well as your heart, and to walk beside you on whatever path you choose." Madeline's own vows, spoken through happy tears, echoed similar sentiments. "I take you, Isaiah Xavier, not just as my husband but as my truest ally. I promise to value your wisdom, to respect your journey, and to create with you a life neither of us could have imagined alone." Their kiss, sealed with the setting sun painting the Colorado sky in spectacular hues, felt like the beginning of a new chapter in a story already more wonderful than either could have predicted. They moved into the foreman's cabin on the Collins property, a sturdy structure that Isaiah had spent weeks preparing, adding bookshelves for Madeline's growing collection, and a small observatory platform where they could position her telescope on clear nights. It was close enough to town that Madeline could easily reach her school each day, but private enough to feel like their own world. That fall, enrollment at the Zephyr School, as it was now officially known, reached 30 students, no longer just girls, but boys too, whose parents had finally recognized the value of scientific education regardless of gender. The Denver Education Society provided funding for additional books and equipment, and Madeline hired an assistant, a young woman from Boulder with training in mathematics. Isaiah thrived in his position as foreman, implementing innovative ranching techniques that increased the Collins operations' productivity while reducing costs. In the evenings, he often joined Madeline at the school, teaching a special course in practical engineering for older students interested in irrigation systems and construction. They settled into a rhythm of shared purpose and mutual support that became the quiet envy of many in Julesburg. Their differences, her Boston refinement and his more rugged experience, complemented rather than conflicted, creating a partnership greater than its individual parts. In the spring of 1878, Madeline discovered she was expecting their first child. The news, joyful as it was, raised inevitable questions about her school. "I don't want to abandon my students," she confided to Isaiah one evening as they sat on their porch, watching distant lightning illuminate the plains. "But I don't know how to manage both." Isaiah considered this thoughtfully. What if it wasn't either/or? What if you trained Emma to take on more responsibility? She graduates this spring, and she's already your best student. With your guidance, she could handle basic classes while you focus on curriculum and the more advanced subjects. A teaching apprenticeship, Madeline mused, warming to the idea. It would give her experience before she leaves for college next year. And, Isaiah added, gently placing his hand on her still flat stomach, our child would grow up surrounded by learning. What better environment could we provide? In November of that year, their son was born, James Galileo Xavier, named for both Isaiah's father and Madeline's scientific hero. Despite predictions that motherhood would diminish her educational zeal, Madeline was back at her school by January, baby in tow. James grew up in the classroom, first in a cradle beside her desk, later toddling between students who adored him, and eventually sitting at his own small desk, soaking up knowledge like the proverbial sponge. He was joined 2 years later by a sister, Isaiah Xavier, equally at home among books and telescopes. The Xavier children became fixtures of the school, embodiments of their parents' belief that education and family need not be separate spheres. By 1885, Julesburg had transformed. Where once stood a typical frontier town suspicious of innovation, now thrived a community increasingly known for its progressive education. The Zephyr School, expanded to a proper building with multiple classrooms, attracted students from neighboring towns and even a few boarders from more distant locations. Emma Collins, having completed 2 years at college in Boulder, returned as a full-fledged teacher specializing in mathematics and physics. Isaiah continued as foreman at the Collins Ranch, but also taught regular classes in practical engineering and astronomy. His reputation for innovative agricultural techniques spread throughout the territory, bringing occasional consulting opportunities that he balanced carefully with his commitment to family and school. Their promontory overlooking the town remained their special place where they retreated for private conversations, celebrated anniversaries, and eventually brought their children to gaze at stars through the improved telescope Isaiah gifted Madeline on their 5th wedding anniversary. On a warm evening in the summer of 1890, 14 years after Madeline had first arrived in Julesburg, they stood together on that same overlook. Below them, the town twinkled with more lights than either could have imagined in those early days. Their school, now officially the Xavier Academy of Science and Mathematics, stood proudly at what had become the educational center of the community. "Did you ever imagine this?" Madeline asked, leaning against Isaiah's shoulder. At 36, she remained as passionate about education as ever, though silver now threaded through her chestnut hair and laugh lines framed her still bright eyes. "Not in my wildest dreams," Isaiah admitted. At 42, he had finally found the peace that had eluded him since the war, in the family and purpose they had built together. "When I rode into Julesburg, I was just looking for work, maybe a place to rest before moving on again. And instead, you found a crazy school teacher nailing up signs," she teased. "I found a visionary," he corrected, pulling her closer. "And she found a lost scholar pretending to be a cowboy. We found each other," Madeline said softly, "and in doing so we found ourselves." Below them, James and Alina could be seen racing back toward the path that led up the hill, having been allowed to visit friends in town while their parents took their evening walk. "Mom, Dad," James called as they approached, his 11-year-old voice cracking with excitement. "Mr. Collins says the newspaper wants to interview you both about the school being recognized by the National Education Association." Alina, 9 and perpetually trying to outdo her brother, added breathlessly. "And Emma says 3 more girls from last year's class got accepted to college." "That makes 7 total." Isaiah and Madeline exchanged proud smiles. Their children, bright, curious, confident, were perhaps their greatest achievement, even beyond the school that had transformed a community. "Well," Isaiah said, ruffling his son's hair, "we should head home then. Sounds like tomorrow will be a busy day." As they walked down the hill together, the family that had once seemed impossible to both of them, Madeline reflected on the journey. From the day she'd arrived in Julesburg alone, determined and, yes, perhaps a little crazy in the eyes of others, to now, surrounded by love and purpose beyond anything she'd dared to dream. The town had called her crazy for believing girls deserved scientific education. Isaiah had called her visionary for the same belief. In the end, they were both right, for sometimes the greatest visions appear as madness until they become reality. Hand in hand with the man who had seen her true self from the beginning, surrounded by the children who represented their shared future, Madeline Zephyr Xavier walked toward home, her heart full with the knowledge that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most perfect destinations.